Okay, so in this final video, we're going to look at a couple short clips, and we're going to look at, through those videos, the ways in which Indigenous knowledge, both historically and now in the present, has been suppressed in favor of other knowledges. But thankfully, we also get to look at the ways in which we can notice and disrupt that in various ways. And we'll talk that through in the discussion and tutorials as well about more about Indigenous wisdom and imagining climate futures as well. I'm just going to pause the screen and get the first video up for you.
Thanks to the funders of Peril and Promise for supporting PBS Digital Studios. Think about the place you grew up as a kid. You probably knew the best shortcut to your friend's house, which tree limbs you could shake to free the juiciest fruit, or how the sky looked just before the streetlights would beckon you home. Your neighborhood was your kingdom, and you knew how to navigate it to get the best out of it. Now, imagine a different way of knowing your neighborhood, one that draws not just on years in a single place, but on generations of knowledge over thousands of years. One where your neighborhood isn't a thing to be conquered, but a relationship to be nurtured. That's the kind of knowledge that exists in Indigenous communities, and their way of knowing might help us all adapt to climate change. Before we get too far, let's get on the same page. First, there's no official definition of Indigenous, but we're using the term to describe communities that self-identify as Indigenous, including those who follow traditional customs and practices that trace back to pre-colonized societies. They often have a relationship with their environment that transcends what they see or feel, and is governed by a system of beliefs, values, or principles that set out how they will interact with the world around them. One Indigenous community, the Inuit of Western Canada, views knowledge passed down through generations to observe the stars, the shapes of clouds, and the behavior of animals to forecast the weather. But today, they can't rely on those forecasts because the weather varies more than ever before. Signs that used to foretell a storm was coming tomorrow could now mean there's a storm coming in the next hour. Indigenous communities have witnessed environmental changes like these for a long time, but their observations have often been dismissed or ignored by Western science. These days, some scientists are recognizing that the knowledge held by Indigenous communities can show us things about our changing world and climate that the scientists can't always detect. When scientist Sherry Gerhard traveled across sea ice on Greenland's northwestern shore, she was shocked when her sled dog's legs punched through the ice, which was unseasonably thin. Knowing the sea ice is 2 inches thick feels more real when it's beneath your feet. But to Inuit travelers on the team, this was the new normal for traveling in the Arctic. Indigenous communities are on the front lines of climate change and its impacts due to their reliance on wild fish, game, and crops, and their firsthand interaction with changes to sensitive environments like declining sea ice. In these communities, adapting to change could mean the difference between existing and not existing. Fortunately, the local knowledge they've developed to navigate the world can also put them in a position to adapt quickly because their knowledge, like any form of science, is dynamic. Communities that have found their weather forecasting techniques more unreliable are adapting and tweaking their methods to better predict the changes as they experience them. Their systems are evolving just as fast as the climate around them. For years, though, the scientific world viewed its observations and way of solving problems as superior to those from Indigenous communities. For example, when Inuit hunters said they saw thunderstorms near Sachs Harbor, Canada, researchers dismissed them and told them it was too cold to see that kind of weather so far north. But the hunters were right. That type of scientific arrogance still exists, but it's starting to fade. Today, Indigenous observations are beginning to be incorporated in disciplines such as forestry, conservation, disaster preparedness, and climate science. Scientists are working alongside Indigenous communities to develop research models, document observations, and importantly, find answers to questions that are useful to both scientists and local communities. Through these partnerships, scientists are learning that daily temperatures in the Arctic fluctuate much more than scientific models indicated. And subsistence hunters are helping collect samples from musk oxen they rely on, which have shown that warmer winters are hurting the health of the herds. Scientists also recognize that the very words within indigenous languages can contain observations about their environment, like how an area called where the caribou mate shows that at one point, a bunch of caribou used to live there, even if it's no longer true. All of this is a start, but it's not enough. Even as some scientists and indigenous communities are working together more closely, many countries still deny indigenous people a meaningful voice on issues that impact them. Indigenous communities are fighting to be recognized as unique groups with particular ways of existing, even if they shouldn't have to prove that to the people who drew borders around them. But the thing is, no one has all the answers, and we will need many kinds of knowledge to tackle the challenges of climate change. Sometimes that knowledge comes from people who have been here all along and from whom we could learn a lot if we were willing to listen. Indigenous communities have survived for thousands of years by using their ways of knowing and adapting. Maybe, just maybe, they're onto something. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, consider
So a big part of what that video was talking about was the subjugation of Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous epistemologies, and how there's a lot of scholarship recently, lots that is published by Indigenous individuals, which is just brilliant, that has talked about the ways in which climate change and the climate crisis has been caused and focused on as well, because we've understood and focused on it differently. And the value and the richness of Indigenous knowledge and the need to draw on them and their understandings and practices, not only to understand what's happening currently, but to develop solutions which are sustainable and ethical as well, because clearly through that video, they have been doing that, and they've been doing that for a while. And we exist at such a great time to see Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and activists now really talk about the need for valuing Indigenous epistemologies, and importantly being heard as well. So because Indigenous people have been talking about this for such a long time, so really using their epistemologies, well, not using, but valuing and listening to their epistemologies and ontologies to address how we can effectively respond to the existential threat that is our current climate crisis. And we've got one more video to just finish up this lecture. By a fantastic woman, so I hope you enjoy this and watch lots and lots of her videos as well.
My greetings from India on two issues that have preoccupied me for such a large part of my life: the issue of forests and the issue of food. Forests is where I was born. I was born in the cradle of the Himalayan forest. I worked with the beautiful movement called Chipko, which was a movement to protect the Himalayan forests when the landslides started and the destruction started. But I have, over these many decades, nearly 5 decades now, not just studied forest systems, food systems, their biodiversity, but also the paradigms that are leading to their destruction. I have been in the spice gardens of Kerala and Karnataka in the Western Ghats. You can't distinguish the forest from the spice gardens. And yet, these were the sources of wealth of India. The spice gardens are what led to Columbus setting sail from India, but he found land in the middle, or the East India Company, or the Dutch and the British being created, all for spices. Thousands of years India had exported spices. With one bag of pepper being weighed for its weight in gold. That's why we were 25% of the world economy. So it's not the case that trade begins with World Trade Organization and globalization. International trade is ancient. And international trade determined by sovereignty of communities, of cultures, of countries. Make sure that people have their food, nature has her biodiversity, and there is international trade, not at the cost of the food security of the people or ecological security. I have watched how a forest went as they were redefined into timber mines and monoculture started to substitute. The rich diversity of forests that my sisters in Chipko were defending. I have watched how our rich biodiverse agriculture, which was like the forest, as Sir Albert Howard recognized when he was sent to India in 1905, Indian farms are as permanent as the forest. And my dear beloved late father, who was a forest officer, used to tell us when we were children, there are more trees on the farms of Uttar Pradesh, the big province of northern India, where he was, than there are in the forests of Uttar Pradesh. So there was no divide between farms and forests. There was no divide between people and nature. These divisions are very, very colonial in their roots. And it is now time to overcome and transcend these divisions, overcome and transcend divisions and extractivism as the economy that is making the majority of ecosystems poorer, that is making communities poorer. And we need to pause and take reflection. Where are the emissions coming from? The rich industrialized world, 1%, is emitting 50%, and the excess emissions beyond the share, 95% are the rich countries. These issues of climate justice are, of course, what are at stake at COP26. But if you look at the other side of the picture, where's biodiversity rich? In the 22% of the land left with indigenous people. The whole planet was indigenous. The whole planet was biodiverse. The whole planet had food for all beings. And now only 22% is left, but that is where the biodiversity is being conserved. So we need to redefine our notions of the wild. Wild is defined in the colonial dictionary as a place without people. Every place with biodiversity, every place with wilderness is a place where caring, compassionate, loving people are. We need to learn from indigenous people. We need to learn from women how we can create economies that do not destroy the earth, do not push biodiversity extinction, do not destroy the climate systems of this planet and bring us to collapse. It's in our hands. It's in our hands if we turn to the earth and our biodiversity. We turn to the forests as our teachers, to the plants as our teachers. And we turn to all of humanity as one family. We turn to all of the biodiversity as one family. Just as we must regenerate biodiversity, and this is what I do day in and day out through Navdanya, the movement I have built over the last 37 years. And we are growing more food. We have more soil fertility. We have more nutrients in the soil. We have water tables rising 70 feet. We have pollinators, even though we didn't start pollination conservation, we just saved seeds. Saving seeds of food sovereignty, saving seeds of seed sovereignty, saving seeds of biodiversity is enabling us to solve all the problems that the planet is facing. And it begins with our forests and farming like the forest and doing economic systems like the forest. Forests are based on diversity. As Tagore said, we have learned democracy from our forests. And economic democracy rests on the biodiversity of economies, not globalized economies in the hands of a few corporations wiping out local economies and leaving destitution everywhere, but prosperous local economies everywhere and high value goods trading to make everyone benefit, not a few at the cost of the many. We are at an exciting moment for the evolution of humanity. We can either choose the path of extinction, continue extinction of other species and ensure our own, or rejuvenate not just our biodiversity, but our economic models, our paradigms, our values. We can move from greed to care. I'm so glad I was able to join you. Thank you.